The heat in the Atchafalaya Basin didn't just sit on you. It aggressively invaded your pores, a heavy, wet blanket that smelled of ancient decay and slow-moving water. Robart adjusted the tripod of his total station, the expensive optical equipment looking absurdly futuristic against the backdrop of gnarled cypress knees and hanging Spanish moss. He wiped a rivulet of sweat from his brow with a grease-stained handkerchief, the fabric rough against skin that felt perpetually sunburned. As a structural engineer contracted by the Army Corps of Engineers, his reality was defined by load-bearing capacities, shear force, and the predictable decay of concrete in saline environments. He dealt in the absolute truths of physics, or at least he used to. It had been 6 months since the incident, the sanitized word he used to cordon off the memory of the car crash that had taken Sarah. Since then, the rigid beams of his logic had developed stress fractures. He took these remote jobs, deep in the Louisiana wetlands, because the isolation was the only acoustic environment where the static in his head quieted down. Here, among the mosquitoes and the black water, he didn't have to pretend to be recovering. He could just exist, a functional machine calibrated for measuring soil erosion and pylon integrity. Sector 4, Piling 7, Robart muttered into his voice recorder, the device clicking softly in the humid silence. Visual inspection shows advanced spalling on the west face, rebar exposure minimal. His voice sounded foreign to his own ears, gravelly from disuse. He was a man who had forgotten how to speak to anything that didn't record him back. The object of his scrutiny was a decaying concrete support from a logging bridge abandoned in the 1970s. It rose from the murk like a tombstone, green with algae and scarred by decades of floods. Robart waded closer, his chest waders sucking tightly against the silt bottom with every step. The mud here was treacherous, a gelatinous slurry that felt less like earth and more like a digestive system waiting for a mistake. He reached the pylon and pulled out his chipping hammer. The protocol was simple. Sound the concrete, check for hollows, measure the depth of the carbonation. It was mundane work, the kind that usually allowed his mind to drift back to Sarah, to the way she used to hum while making coffee, the specific scent of her vanilla shampoo. But today, the swamp refused to let him drift. There was a wrongness in the air, a subtle dissonance that his instincts, honed by years of walking dangerous construction sites, picked up before his conscious mind did. It was the silence. The Atchafalaya was never silent. It was a cacophony of crickets, bullfrogs, distant boat motors, and the splashes of garfish. But now the air was dead. The silence was heavy, pressurized, as if the atmosphere were holding its breath. Robart shook his head, blaming the heat. He raised the hammer and struck the concrete. Thwack! The sound was wrong. It shouldn't have been a dull thud. It should have been a sharp clink, the sound of steel hitting high-density stone. He frowned, leaning in closer, his nose inches from the algae-slicked surface. The concrete looked normal, gray, pitted, stained with tannin. He struck it again, harder. Thwack! It sounded wet, soft. "Water saturation?" he whispered, forcing the engineer's vocabulary over the rising unease. "Impossible. This is Type 2 Portland. It shouldn't absorb like a sponge." He scraped the surface with the claw of his hammer. Instead of chipping away in dusty flakes, the material peeled. It came away in a long, coherent strip, like the skin of a sunburned shoulder. Beneath the gray, rough exterior was not the aggregate of stone and sand, but a pale, fibrous substance. It was pinkish-white, veined with darker capillaries that pulsed almost imperceptibly. Robart recoiled, his boots slipping in the mud, splashing black water up to his waist. He caught his balance on the tripod, his heart hammering against his ribs. He stared at the pylon.
The patch he had peeled was oozing a clear, viscous fluid. It smelled faintly of copper and musk, a scent that triggered a primal alarm in the reptilian base of his brain. Fungal bloom, he rationalized, his voice trembling. Some kind of invasive slime mold mimicking the substrate. He was grasping at straws, trying to build a scaffold of logic over a pit of madness. He forced himself to step forward again. He had to know. He was a man of facts. Facts were the only things that didn't leave you. He reached out with a gloved hand and pressed his thumb against the concrete. It yielded. It wasn't stone. It was warm. The heat of it seeped through his glove, distinct from the ambient humidity. It was the warmth of a living metabolism. He snatched his hand back, revulsion coiling in his gut. He looked down at the water surrounding the pylon. The surface was perfectly still, a mirror reflecting the darkening sky. But deep down, in the brown gloom, something was moving, not swimming, shifting. The root system of the nearby cypress tree seemed to be rearranging itself. Robart grabbed his camera from the equipment vest. He needed proof. He needed to capture this anomaly, freeze it in a JPEG, and analyze it until it made sense. He raised the lens, focusing on the bleeding patch of the pylon. Through the viewfinder, the world was framed and manageable. He zoomed in on the fibrous texture. And then, the pylon flinched. It was a subtle contraction, a ripple running up the length of the column. The concrete tightened, the algae stretching like hair on a tense muscle. A low sound emanated from the structure, a wet, gurgling groan that vibrated through the water and up into the soles of Robart's feet. It wasn't the creak of settling foundation, it was the sound of a stomach growling. Robart backed away, his rational mind screaming him to stop, to measure, to quantify, but his body, the animal vessel, was screaming to run. He stumbled back toward the bank, dragging the heavy total station with him, unwilling to leave the expensive gear behind, a ridiculous grounded impulse in the face of the impossible. As he reached the drier mud of the bank, he looked back. The pylon was still there, motionless again. The wound he had inflicted was closing, the gray skin knitting itself back together with terrifying speed. But the most horrifying detail wasn't the healing. It was the realization of what the structure actually was. It wasn't a pillar supporting a bridge. It was a finger, a single, rigid, partially submerged finger of something vast that was buried deep in the Louisiana mud, something that had been holding still for 40 years, waiting for someone to wake it up. Robart collapsed onto the root ball of a dead oak, his breathing coming in ragged gasps. He looked at his hand, the one that had touched the thing. The glove was stained with the clear fluid. He peeled the glove off and threw it into the water. He stared at his trembling fingers. They looked normal, but he could still feel the phantom warmth, the pulse of the pylon. The sun began to dip below the tree line, casting long, bruised shadows across the water. The silence broke. The cicadas started screaming, but their rhythm was frantic, out of sync, a chaotic alarm rather than a nightly chorus. Robart grabbed his radio. "Base, this is Robart, calling it for the day. Equipment malfunction." He didn't mention the flesh. He didn't mention the warmth. If he said it out loud, it would become real, and Robart couldn't handle any more reality. He packed his gear with shaking hands, avoiding looking at the water. But as he turned to hike back to his truck, he saw it, or thought he saw it, out of his corner of the eye. A second pylon, 50 yards downriver, slowly bending, like a joint testing its range of motion. He didn't look back again. He marched through the sawgrass, the grief for Sarah momentarily displaced by a cold, suffocating dread. The world had always been cruel to him, taking what he loved. But he had always believed the world was dead. Physics. He was wrong. The world wasn't dead. It was hungry.
The total station's liquid crystal display flickered, not with the erratic pulse of a dying battery, but with a rhythmic, purposeful dimming that matched the thrumming in Robart's ears. He stared at the readout. Elevation, minus 12.4 meters. Impossible. He was standing on a sediment ridge that the USGS maps confirmed was 3 feet above the waterline. If the machine was right, he was currently submerged deep beneath the bayou's floor. He tapped the casing, the plastic hot enough to blister his thumb. The readout shifted. Elevation, plus 300 meters. Calibration error, he muttered, the sound of his own voice startlingly flat in the dense acoustic dampening of the cypress grove. Thermal expansion affecting the internal gyroscope. He recited the engineering failures like a catechism, a shield of jargon against the creeping dread. But his hands shook as he unlatched a device from the tripod. The metal legs came out of the mud with a wet, sucking pop, sounding obscenely biological, like a hip joint being dislocated. He packed the gear with frantic precision, his eyes refusing to look directly at the water surrounding his small patch of dry land. In his peripheral vision, the surface of the swamp wasn't behaving like water. It didn't ripple outward from the disturbances of falling leaves or jumping insects. Instead, the ripples moved inward, converging toward the center of the channel, as if a drain had been opened, or as if something large, just beneath the surface, was inhaling the liquid. Robart threw the equipment bag into the aluminum flat-bottomed skiff, the metal clanging loud enough to silence the cicadas for a heartbeat. When their chittering returned, it sounded different, sharper, synchronous, like the grinding of a million tiny gears. He yanked the starter cord of the outboard motor. It sputtered, choked on the thick, humid air, and died. "Come on," he hissed, gripping the handle with white-knuckled desperation. He thought of Sarah then, unbidden, not the Sarah of the warm Sundays, but the Sarah of the wreckage, trapped behind the crumpled dashboard, the physics of momentum and inertia having done their terrible work on her frame. The memory wasn't a picture, it was a sound, the specific wet crunch of safety glass giving way. He pulled again. The engine roared to life, coughing blue smoke that hung low over the water. Robart didn't look back at the cypress grove. He gunned the throttle, the bow of the skiff rising as he cut a wake through the duckweed. The bayou was a labyrinth of shadows and rot. Hanging moss brushed his face like cobwebs, leaving a residue that smelled of copper and old blood. He headed for the only structure within 10 miles, Landry's Bait and Tackle, a glorified shack on stilts that leaned precariously over the dark water of the Henderson Swamp. Landry was a fixture here, a man whose skin looked like cured tobacco and who spoke a version of Cajun French that Robart usually found charming, but today felt alien, hostile. As the skiff bumped against the tire bumpers of Landry's dock, Robart killed the engine. The silence that rushed in was heavy, physical. He tied off the boat, his movements jerky. He needed to hear a human voice. He needed someone to tell him the heat was playing tricks on the optics. Landry was sitting on a plastic lawn chair on the porch, whittling a piece of driftwood. He didn't look up as Robart climbed the wooden ladder, the rungs slick with algae. "You packing out early, Cher?" Landry's voice was gravel rolling in a cement mixer. He stopped whittling but didn't look at Robart. He was staring at the water where Robart's boat was docked. "Equipment failure," lied Robart, wiping his face with his sleeve. The sweat felt cold now. "The heat's messing with the laser levels. I'm getting impossible readings, negative elevation, rapid fluctuations." Landry finally looked up. His eyes were milky with cataracts, yet they seemed to focus on something just behind Robart's left shoulder. "Machine ain't wrong. It's the ground that's changin'. The mud. It breathes today." Robart scoffed, falling back on his irritation to mask the fear. "Mud doesn't breathe, Landry. It's soil mechanics. Liquefaction, maybe, due to the high water table. I just need to recalibrate in a controlled environment." "You smell that?" Landry pointed the knife toward the boat. Robart sniffed. He expected the usual swamp funk, decaying vegetation, fish, diesel, but underneath that there was something sharp, chemical, like ozone and formaldehyde. "It smells like a storm coming," Robart said dismissively.
"Smells like the bottom coming up," Landry corrected. He stood, his joints popping, and walked to the railing. He spat a stream of dark tobacco juice into the water. "When you didn't see nothing out there, in the cypress heavy?" "I saw bad data, that's it," Robart snapped. Landry turned to him, his face devoid of humor. "My daddy used to say that when the water gets this steel, it ain't peace, it's patience. Something's waiting. You got something on your boot, son." Robart looked down. Clinging to the heel of his heavy work boot was a glob of sludge. It wasn't gray or brown like the surrounding mud. It was iridescent, shimmering with an oil-slick rainbow of purples and greens. As Robart watched, the substance didn't dry or flake off. It pulsed, a slow, rhythmic contraction, about 60 beats per minute, a resting heart rate. Robart kicked his foot violently against the wooden piling, scraping the matter off the dock. It fell onto the dock with a wet thwack. It didn't splatter. It recoiled, pulling itself back into a sphere before slowly flattening out again. "What the hell did you spill on the dock, Landry?" Robart's voice rose an octave. "I didn't spill nothing," Landry whispered, taking a step back. "You brought that in from the deep cut. That's old silt. That stuff ain't been topside since the floods of '27. Robart crouched, his engineer's curiosity warring with a primal revulsion. He reached for a twig to prod the substance. As the wood touched the iridescent slime, the slime reacted, a pseudopod whipping around the twig, dissolving the bark instantly with a faint hiss. "Don't touch it," Landry yelled, kicking the twig out of Robart's hand and into the water. "It's acidic," Robart murmured, his mind racing through chemical possibilities. "Industrial runoff? Illegal dumping? I need to get a sample. If there's toxic waste out here, the Corps needs to know." "You listen to me, city boy. You don't sample it. You don't measure it. You get in your truck, you drive back to Baton Rouge, and you tell 'em the swamp is closed. You hear me?" Suddenly, a sound echoed from under the dock. It wasn't a splash. It was a mechanical grinding, followed by a sharp crunch. Robart froze. The blood drained from his face. He knew that sound. It was the sound of a radiator grill folding around a telephone pole. It was the sound of his Honda Civic dying on I-10 6 months ago. "Did you hear that?" he whispered.
He started the truck and peeled out, gravel spraying. He told himself he was exhausted, heat stroke, grief hallucination. But as he drove away from the swamp, he glanced at the rearview mirror. On the back window of the truck, on the outside, was a handprint. It wasn't made of mud. It was made of that iridescent, pulsing slime, and it had 6 fingers. The sucking sound of the tripod legs leaving the mud didn't stop when the metal cleared the surface. It continued, a wet, rhythmic mastication coming from the earth itself, as if the soil were chewing on the space where the equipment had just stood. Robart hoisted the total station over his shoulder, the heavy composite casing slamming against his clavicle. The pain was a grounding wire, a sharp reminder of his own physicality in a world that was rapidly losing its definition. He checked his watch, a mechanical field watch Sarah had bought him, immune to the digital rot affecting his surveying gear. The hands were frozen at 3:14, the second hand twitching back and forth like a trapped insect leg. "Mechanical failure," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Magnetism, iron deposits in the silt." He began to walk, abandoning the planned transect line. The map in his pocket, a laminated USGS quadrangle, claimed there was a levee road half a mile east past a cluster of dead cypresses, but the geography was gaslighting him. The trees here didn't grow towards the sun, they spiraled inward, their branches weaving together into a claustrophobic lattice that blocked out the sky, turning the afternoon into a bruised sepia twilight. The humidity had ceased to be weather. It was now a medium, viscous and gelatinous, coating the inside of his throat with the taste of ozone and stagnant blood. Robart trudged forward, his boots sinking past the ankles. Every step required a conscious negotiation with the suction of the bayou. He wasn't just walking, he was being permitted to move by a substrate that felt disturbingly muscular. He needed a reference point, a benchmark. In structural engineering, you always started with a known elevation. Here, there was only the shifting relativity of rot. After 20 minutes of struggling through sawgrass that sliced at his forearms, the dense vegetation broke abruptly. He stumbled into a clearing that shouldn't have existed. In the center of a black water pool, resting on a sandbar that looked suspiciously like pulverized bone, sat a structure. It was a dredging barge, rusted to the color of dried paprika, its hull fused with the roots of a massive live oak. The vessel looked less like a boat and more like a tumor that the swamp had failed to digest. Smoke, smelling of burnt chicory and diesel, curled from a crooked stovepipe jutting from the wheelhouse. Robart hesitated. Protocol dictated he radio base, but his radio had been dead since the elevation reading glitch. Isolation, usually his preferred state since the funeral, now felt a physical weight pressing on his chest. He waded toward the barge, the water rising to his waist, tepid and oily. "Hello?" he called out. The word died instantly, absorbed by the moss. He hauled himself onto the rusted deck, the metal groaning under his weight. The corrosion pattern was wrong. Rust usually flakes. This metal looked like it was molting, soft and pliable under his grip. He moved toward the wheelhouse, his hand instinctively reaching for the wrench in his belt loop, a useless weapon against the scale of the dread rising in his gut, but a comfort nonetheless. The door to the wheelhouse swung open before he touched it. Inside, the space was illuminated by a single kerosene lantern that cast long, oscillating shadows. Sitting on a milk crate was a man who looked as though he had been constructed from the debris of the basin. His skin was the texture of cured tobacco leaves, tight against a skull that seemed slightly too large for his face. He wore filth-stiffened overalls and was meticulously cleaning a fillet knife with a rag that looked like a piece of a woman's dress. "You brought the heavy eyes," the man said. His voice was a rasp like sandpaper on concrete. He didn't look up from the knife. Robart stood in the doorway, dripping black water onto the floorboards. "I'm with the Corps. My equipment malfunctioned. I need to use a radio." The man chuckled, a wet, rattling sound. "Corps, engineers, measuring the distance between two lies. There ain't no radio here, Cher. Signals don't like the curvature of this place." "Who are you?" Robart asked, stepping into the room. The floor was tilted at a distinct 15-degree angle, throwing his equilibrium off. "Elias, or that's what the last one called me before he swam down." Elias finally looked up. His eyes were milky, covered in cataracts, yet he focused directly at the total station on Robart's shoulder. "That machine tells you where you are?" "It measures spatial coordinates, elevation, angles," Robart said, falling back on the sterile comfort of his profession. "It's failing. The heat is affecting the sensors." "Not the heat, Ewan. It's the depth. You think you standing on top of the world, but the bottom dropped out a long time ago, since the sorrow came." Robart stiffened. The sorrow. It was a generic term, yet it pierced him. "I don't have time for riddles. If you have a boat, I can pay you to take me to the landing." Elias stood up. He was tall, impossibly thin, his limbs articulating at angles that suggested disjointed connections. "Come, you want to see the measurements? You want to see what the water is building?" Against every instinct screaming at him to run, Robart followed Elias out the back of the wheelhouse to the stern. A heavy winch hung over the water, a thick chain disappearing into the murky depths. "The Corps thinks this is all silt and flow rates," Elias muttered, grabbing the winch handle. "They think they can hold back the water with concrete, but the water remembers. It takes what is owed." Elias began to crank. The chain grew taut, vibrating with tension. Something massive was on the other end. Robart watched, mesmerized by the dark water swirling directly beneath the stern.
Bubbles, thick and iridescent, broke the surface. Swamp gas, methane, the byproduct of decay. But the smell wasn't just rot. It was the distinct, sharp scent of antifreeze and lavender perfume. Robart's breath hitched. That smell. It was the specific olfactory combination of Sarah's car after the radiator had cracked, mixing with the scent she always wore on her neck. "Stop," Robart said, his voice trembling. "What is that?" "The catch," Elias grunted, heaving on the winch. The surface broke. It wasn't a fish. It wasn't an alligator. Suspended from a large meat hook was a mass of wet gray matter, sediment fused with biological tissue. It pulsed, but as the water sluiced off, the shape became horrifyingly clear. It was a mimicry of a car door, formed entirely from river clay and muscle fibers. The window was a membrane of translucent fish scales, and in the molding, embedded in the muck like a fossil, was a human hand, not a skeleton, a fresh, preserved hand, clutching the handle. Robart stumbled back, hitting the railing. The engineering part of his brain tried to categorize it, pareidolia, a random accumulation of debris, but the ring on the finger of the mud hand caught the lantern light, a simple silver band with a stress fracture. "It builds what you bring it," Elias whispered, leaning close to Robart, his breath smelling of raw catfish. "You brought a lot of grief into the basin, engineer. That's heavy load-bearing material." The mud door pulsed, and from the scaled membrane came a sound, not a roar, but the screech of tires on asphalt, perfectly replicated by wet vocal cords.